behalf of the MIT Sloan School of Management and the MIT Leadership Center, it is my distinct pleasure to welcome you to the semester's final presentation of the Dean's Innovative Leadership Series. And it is a great honor to introduce Terry Kelly, the President and CEO of W.L. Gore & Associates, a company that has deservedly been recognized as a Fortune magazine top 100 places to work for the past 11 years. We are delighted to welcome her to MIT Sloan today. The more that we see and learn about the unique Gore culture, the more that we believe that it is truly extraordinary. There are very few organizational charts and titles. There is what we call on-demand hierarchy. That is hierarchy that comes into play only when it's needed and people feel like they really want it there. There are more coaches than bosses, and information sharing and peer review are the norm. Terry, this is very hard to believe, but Terry was nominated to be the CEO of this organization. When the previous CEO retired 3 years ago, people or associates within the company were asked to nominate anyone, not a selective list, anyone in the company to be the CEO. They nominated Terry. She is the fourth CEO in the company's 50-year history and got that title in 2005. Terry is amazingly reflective about herself and her organization and truly lives the cultural values that represent Gore. She believes that it is the culture and the practices at Gore that motivate innovation and productivity among associates. Just because you have a title or are given a position doesn't mean that you get to tell people what to do. If you have a great idea, you have to convince other people that it's great. You have to get them on your team to implement the idea, and then it's your job to keep them motivated for results, but very much within the Gore culture. Terry says that the result is a freer, more innovative, and flexible workforce. We say that it is a company that follows what we call distributed leadership and really makes it work. The results seem to bear both of us out. Gore has been growing revenues consistently at 7 to 9% a year for the last decade. And voluntary turnover is just 5%, a strikingly low number for the industry. Terry has spent her 25-year career with Gore, beginning as a process engineer, then a product specialist with the military fabrics business. She was also part of the leadership team that expanded the fabrics division throughout Asia before becoming the president and CEO. Please let us give a warm welcome to this very dynamic leader, Terry Kelly.
Deborah. Wow. Thank you. Can you hear me? It's all right? How are we doing today? All right? What a great group. It's a pleasure for me to be here today. And what I'd like to spend the next 30 minutes talking to you about is a little bit more about Gore, but more importantly, kind of how we use the culture to drive our business results. And this is a topic very passionate for me, and I probably spend a significant amount of my time focused on actually the environment of Gore, because I'm a firm believer if you get the environment right, actually the business stuff is quite easy. And so spending a lot of time on the foundational pieces really is one of my passions. And I'll talk about how we put that to work in Gore and then leave some time for possibly some questions that you might have. So for us, we are a family-based company. Those of you that know our roots, we are coming up on our 50-year anniversary. I had the good fortune of actually working closely with Bill and Viv Gore. And what struck me was that they probably spent as much time and attention to the culture and the environment, and they knew that was a critical link to really driving innovation and driving our success. And some would argue that that was probably more developed than actually our business plan and how we were actually going to make money. But I think for me, and you hear a lot of companies today, and particularly CEOs trying to find their way and really get back to a distributed leadership model and how do you empower the organization. We have a different challenge. We've had an empowered organization for 50 years. Now it's how do you make it work in a very different global, complex environment? And that's obviously where I spend a lot of my time and attention. For those that you don't know about Gore, we've actually grown quite a bit over the past 50 years. We're about $2.5 billion in revenue, very global in terms of our scope. We remain privately held, which we can talk about. We find certainly some key advantages to that in terms of our approach and obviously our culture. And all of our associates, we talk about our employees as associates, and our language in Gore is very critical because really all of our associates are owners in the company. And so that's how we like to look at it, that they feel a very different level of commitment and ownership as an investor in the success of the Gore enterprise. And as Deborah mentioned, we actually probably affirmation that the culture is working and that we really are creating, I think, a good environment. We get a lot of external recognition of this. And what I'd like to look at is the sustainability of our performance on lists like the Fortune list, which gives me the indication it's not just a point in time, that it's really the foundation that we've established that allows us to have this great culture. And also the scale, because we want our culture not just to work in the US, but also how does it work in Europe? How does it work as we enter into new markets in Asia Pacific as well? Those of you may know us as the Gore-Tex company. I'm suspecting hopefully there's some Gore-Tex users, but probably what's not well known is we're actually a very diversified company. And so our roots actually are in wire and cable was the first application that we went after. And so we're in applications like venting, sealant products. We are in some of the lead technologies for fuel cells. We're in filter bags. Probably one of the most exciting areas of development right now is in medical devices. So we have a whole range of products for the treatment of cardiovascular disease, stent graft products. We invented Glide dental floss. And so it's just a very big mix. And I think on the surface, you're probably saying it just looks so distracted and unfocused. And so from the outside, it probably looks that way. From a technical perspective, I'm an engineer, so I like to look at things from a technical perspective. There's a method to the madness. And so if you look at it from an inside-out perspective, we actually have a very solid foundation around what we call core technology. And this is our material-based focus in fluoropolymers. And you can see how this focus in fluoropolymers have led us into tubes that go into vascular grafts, or fibers that go into dental floss, or membranes that go into Gore-Tex fabric. This is a critical strength for us because you can get the diversity of these very different markets, but at the same time, you've got something that we can leverage across the enterprise and continue to invest in and expand upon, which we talk about as core technology. So because we're so diverse, we take a very decentralized approach to how we organize things at Gore. So loosely, we have 4 main divisions around these market segments. And our whole approach is to push as much of that out to the various businesses and divisions within Gore and give them as much autonomy, as much profit and loss responsibility as possible. Probably what we're most known for beyond the Gore-Tex brand is around our unique culture. And again, some of the facets, and I want to spend the majority of my talk talking about the culture because it really is about this fundamental belief in individuals and trusting people that if you give them the right tools, you give them the right knowledge, that people are fundamentally motivated to do the right thing. And so it's a very high-intensity, personal relationship-based organization. We spend an inordinate amount of time building teams, having teams come together to build that. We have minimal bureaucracy. We have some that creeps into the organization, but we try to minimize the amount of unnecessary bureaucracy. We have a high expectation for networking, so everyone really has to build what we call their lattice in Gore. So you have a personal responsibility of connecting throughout the Gore organization to really make sure that knowledge is shared. And lastly, leaders play a very unique role that I'll come back to at the end, which is they're only leaders if someone wants to actually follow them, which is kind of a novel concept, but creates its own set of challenges for leaders in Gore. This is a busy slide, but I want to just explain that because the culture is such a rich part of how we communicate in our organization and how we want to drive both actions and behaviors, you will find a poster like this probably in every plant conference room at Gore. And the reason is we want it to drive our conversation. So a lot of companies, you hear about their values, you hear about their culture, But if it's not an integral part of how you make decisions and how leaders talk about how we get the work done, it really becomes pretty superficial. So this is kind of a way that we try to make that more explicit in the organization. And one of the key learnings over our history of Gore, when Bill Gore formed W.L. Gore and Associates, we didn't even use the word culture. I think it creeped into our language probably several decades after the company was founded, but we found we needed to do a better job of making it clear to the organization of really what are the elements of our culture that are truly part of the core of who we are. And we found we had to make a distinction of what we call kind of our fundamental beliefs. And this is, again, that belief in individuals, the fact we want to organize around small teams, the fact that we want to be all part of a Gore enterprise. So even though we want this kind of autonomy, we also want everyone to feel this different set of ownership as far as part of being the Gore enterprise, and the fact we want to take a long-term view. And my hunch is being privately held has had some advantages of really keeping that perspective. But we want to distinguish between this part of the culture and what we'll call our practices. Because one of the traps that you run into is you build such a strong culture, it becomes almost cult-like, and you want to change something, people will say, well, that's countercultural. And so even in our evolution, we found that you really need to make the distinction so that not only you have a strong foundation that gives a sense of security and values, but you also want to make sure it can adapt to the challenges in today's environment. So obviously, 50 years from the founding of our company, some of our challenges today are quite different in terms of the global complexity and some of the external influences on our business. The other thing Bill Gore was very keen on is that he hated policy manuals and he hated very bureaucratic ways of telling the organization what to do. One, you'll never get it right because every situation is very unique. And it also takes the judgment out of the individual in terms of really applying that particular circumstance and making the right decision. So we use kind of our 4 principles, which are freedom, fairness, commitment, and waterline, which really helps associates navigate through how they make decisions, what input that they need. So this, again, has become kind of a framework of how we communicate within the Gore environment. Historically, we had a very simplistic view of how the culture allowed us to drive business results. You started with these very passionate associates that were truly excited about what they were working on. And then you combine it with these empowered teams that were really diverse in their perspective. They challenged each other. They came together to support each other. And voila, business results happen. And you create this kind of flywheel effect. One of my observations as I took on my role is this was a very superficial view of what really drives the culture and how would you even know the culture is working to achieve business results? Because culture for culture's sake really doesn't serve a purpose unless you're driving it and making sure you're getting the output. And so even within Gore, after so many years of having this rich culture, we needed to even do a better job of really what I'd call defining what is the real strategic intent. And so as we have so many new associates that have joined the Gore organization, obviously there's a real chance for confusion. There's a lot of things written about Gore, about the freedom principle, that I'm free to do whatever I want. There's a lot of folks that take nuances of the Gore culture. And I think what you'll realize is it all has to work as a system. So any one element, which I would characterize as part of Gore in terms of what we would see as part of our culture, in itself will not ensure our success. And so what we try to get our leaders focused on is we need to make sure that the real strategic intent that was embodied in what Bill Gore had envisioned, we're living up to it. And this is an active investment. And so one of the takeaways, a culture isn't something done to you. This is something you have to invest, just like we invest in our product innovation. You have to invest time, energy, and it's hard work. It's hard work to actually make it deliver what you really want it to deliver. And I would say the benefit far exceeds that because just the level of energy and commitment and ownership is just phenomenal in terms of driving business results. So this is kind of a framework we use. And really one of the roles of leaders is to use this as kind of a diagnostic tool to make sure actually we're delivering on the promise of the culture. I'm going to talk about some of our practices, and there's many practices we have in Gore, but some that have stood the test of time. One of them is this whole idea that we want small plants. And I think in many companies, there's just this great temptation to pull in these mega facilities, mega global platforms. And we found quite the opposite. When things get to be around 200, 250 associates, we will consciously look at ways to split it up with the idea that there's a different level of ownership. Typically, the larger, more dominant part of the business will kind of stifle all the creativity of the smaller, kind of developing part of the business. So we will look for ways to, as Bill Gore described it, divide so that we can multiply. It's a very powerful concept, and we have replicated this throughout Gore, which is why you see hundreds of different facilities in Gore. Many will look at that as an unbelievable expense, but we think this is a huge element that is a catalyst for our growth, because you create this incredible amount of ownership and focus around these different opportunities that we're focused on. So that one has been critical. The other thing which you'll hear described is our associates vote with their feet. We don't tell people what to do, nor do we tell them what projects to work on. We want them to go where their passion is. And our finding is when you can kind of converge where someone's really passionate with where their knowledge and skills are, with where the business needs are, it's a really powerful combination. And just the level of ownership and investment that associates puts into the work is a very different feeling than someone thinking of an employer-employee kind of relationship. So we organize around small teams. And so that, again, is a great way to really look at where the energy and passion is around our most promising opportunities within Gore. As I mentioned, there's an incredible expectation for networking and sharing of knowledge within the organization. Some of the other things, probably not surprising, our hiring process is pretty rigorous. I hear horror stories that it takes months and months, because a lot of it's not about testing their technical competence. It's much more around a values discussion. Deborah mentioned around titles. We have very few titles in Gore. I'm probably one that has an actual official legitimate title. And it may seem a small point, but the difference between a commitment, which is something that really describes the individual and what their personal strengths are. We don't want to put folks in a box where there's some assumed responsibility or assumed authority that can be very much embedded in a title. So we like the idea that people make commitments, versus titles do create some kind of power and assumed authority that we really don't want to drive within Gore. Everyone has discretionary time to work on things. One of the things when you're a very innovative company, you want to have very low barriers to experimentation. So we don't want to create a lot of bureaucracy where you can test things out very quickly in Gore and kill things very quickly. So we don't have these big visible failures of our projects, because a lot of times you're testing a lot of uncertainties and you just want to find out very quickly whether it's going to be successful or not. Some folks describe Gore more as this picture, and I think there's some kind of a misnomer that because you have such a happy, free-spirited organization that things can be harmonious, everyone is just aligned. And I have to tell you, it's quite the opposite. You know, if you really empower your organizations and you think about bringing the head, the heart, the soul, the spirit, and very diverse ways of looking at things, because when you have this incredible amount of ownership, people speak their mind. And they don't all agree, by the way. You can go into a Gore meeting and sometimes it's frightening. But they're all getting to get to the best outcome. I think the difference is it's not personal. They really want to make sure we're doing the right thing. So for leaders, it's actually quite chaotic. You know, we talk about it herding cats some days. And I think maybe the other misnomer is that Gore has sources of discipline. So whereas you hear about the freedom principle, you hear about how we empower associates, one of the other ways it works is you've got to also have some disciplines that everyone kind of subscribes to kind of make it work as a system. And I'll just explain some of them. So clearly, because we are driven by innovation, we have a very methodical way of how we do innovation in terms of how we describe our opportunities, how we value one opportunity versus another. So these are kind of a common language within Gore. And I think the reason it works is people in Gore understand that we need to do that well to deliver business results. If I tried to put some bureaucratic process in place just for filling out travel investment forms, they'd probably throw me out of my office. So it's really finding the distinction of where discipline is actually valued by the organization. The good news is if it's not, it just gets spit out and rejected. You know, obviously, discretion's earned over time. When you walk into the Gore company, you don't have endless freedom. You earn that over time, and I think that's critical. And this rigorous peer review. So rather than a company typically where you have the manager kind of leading and deciding on what projects to work on, and they're kind of the assessor of of what we're going to work on. What I think is much more powerful is when you distribute that to a broad base of teams, and there's a natural peer pressure that's happening within your organization to let the best ideas and the best concepts bubble to the surface. We have a couple other principles. I won't go through all of them, but certainly a lot of our value is created through intellectual property. So we're fanatical about protecting intellectual property and all the things that are around that. We never talk about expenses in Gore. We talk about investments. And the concept here is we want every associate to think of every dollar that they spend, is this really a wise investment? So the level of ownership is much higher than what you'd find maybe in other organizations. And we have a very unique role in Gore, which is a sponsor. This is not your boss. This is someone that has made a personal commitment to your success in Gore. And so if you think about it, it's almost like your personal coach, and it's a really critical commitment. Everyone in Gore has a sponsor. We actually said if you can't find a sponsor, you probably have a problem. That there's not one person in the organization that's willing to invest time and develop for you to reach your full potential. And the nice thing there is they really are there to help that person develop and grow, which can be conflicted sometimes if it's actually the manager or leader, because they're obviously trying to balance what's best for the business, not always what's best for the development for the associate. And so that's a critical role within Gore. We talked about the power of small teams and that peer pressure. The one practice and discipline that's probably been, I'd say, really critical to our success is our compensation peer review process. So just to imagine this, that everyone in the company is ranked by their peers, including myself. And the incredible ownership that feels of, I want to be number one on my list. So if I'm ranked, I want to prove that I'm making the greatest contribution to this success of the enterprise. And who better knows who's really making the impact than the folks that you're surrounded with? And so what it does is it creates not only this, we're a very competitive company, so everyone wants to be viewed as number one, but at the same time, they need to do it in a way that's collaborative, because just being the individual contributor that alienates you from all of your peers is also not healthy. And so it creates an incredible checks and balances that we found has been really powerful in really flipping the whole peer review, and really how we pay associates in Gore is based on that process. And so that's one I think that has fundamentally been critical to our success. So I think the summation of this is if you've got kind of the right people in your organization, a strong set of values, and just a key few set of objectives, you actually don't need a lot of rules and hierarchy. And in most organizations, the natural tendency, particularly as things get more chaotic, is to actually impart more structure. And the problem you create from that is you actually stifle more of the creativity and the empowerment. So it becomes a vicious cycle. So this is something that we spend a lot of time really putting disciplines in where it matters and trying to minimize bureaucracy and structure that really is going to actually take you away from achieving your business results. So up to this time, I haven't talked a lot about leadership at Gore, but suffice it to say, it's a really tough place to lead, because you have to earn your leadership every day. You never arrive as a leader in Gore, so you do it through influence. And so you think about it, how much is about power and power embedded in the title or commitment. We kind of strip that away and say you're only a leader, one, if people actually want to follow you. And then once you're in a leadership role, you really need to explain your actions and the rationale behind your decisions. And it's a very powerful model in Gore. And I can tell you every day, if you're not living up to that, the associates will let you know. So there's a built-in mechanism based on our contribution process, as well as just peer feedback that's happening routinely within Gore. We have put a little bit more work into kind of how we talk about leadership in Gore, and this is a very simple puzzle. And so it starts with leading self. I will say in this kind of environment, you really need associates to be very reflective of their strengths, their weaknesses, and really self-aware of their impact on the greater organization. We obviously care about them getting things done. So, we are a results-driven culture. We care about them kind of creating the vision and really driving kind of the future outlook and the inspiration of where we're heading. This is a newer one. We're getting Gore leaders to actually lead through others versus actually trying to do it all themselves. So that's another key dimension. And then not by accident, the middle piece is around living and modeling the culture. Because in this environment, we do care about not just what they accomplish, but for sure how they accomplish it. And that's why it's probably harder in Gore, because both matter in terms of your absolute contribution and impact to our success. So what does it take to lead in this very empowered organization? And these are just a couple thoughts. One is you have to really be comfortable operating without assumed authority and control. And I think intellectually everyone gets that, but when you strip folks away from power and they have to do it all through influence, it's amazing things happen. Not all good, by the way. But you have to really feel comfortable as a leader in that environment. You actually have to trust individuals to do the right thing. That's a novel concept. But you have to believe if you give that knowledge and you spread it, you're actually going to get a broader impact than if you try to hoard it and you're kind of the center of attention and the center of knowledge. In Gore, our communication expectations are high. Because, if I talk about we're going to move to build a new plant in China, I don't say we're going to China, get over it. There are multiple conversations around why this is consistent with our culture, why is this fair? So you think about it around our principles, and you really are trying to get the organization to have a different level of understanding. One could argue it takes more time up front. I would say that the implementation goes that much smoother, because how many decisions get revisited because you really don't have the true buy-in from the organization. So we'd rather do the upfront work. But again, leaders have to be willing to explain. It's like your kids. They have to explain the why. It's not good enough just to say what. It's why are we doing this? And do it in the context of our values. One thing that's a misnomer, even when we have leaders in different roles, the knowledge shifts where the folks who are most knowledgeable about the subject matter, where in some organizations it just ends up trickling to that top person as if they're the most knowledgeable on every subject matter, where you really want to push the knowledge to where you've got that in your organization. And you can imagine with 8,500 Gore associates, we've got a wide array of knowledge in the organization to tap into. And obviously, in any system, there's ambiguities. There's never clarity. You're always managing these polarities, competing objectives. So you really have to be comfortable in that space. So if you need a lot of structure and a lot of things kind of simplified, I think this would be a really tough environment. And I think in any situation when you're under stress and things get really tough, like in today's economic environment, the natural tendency is to put more structure, more bureaucracy. And we would argue that that's probably the last thing you need to do. It's really to go back to the fundamentals and to go back to the basic values and really look at, are there some areas that you can help really educate and build more discipline in the organization versus just bureaucratic systems. And then, as I mentioned, certainly all of our leaders in Gore spend an inordinate amount of time making sure the environment works. And again, I would contend if you get that right, so that everyone understands what's important, what's valued, what is our key disciplines, you actually let the organization take over. And if you think about all the issues of global scale and complexity, I can't imagine leading without really, again, distributing that leadership load across a broad organization. But you need to spend a lot more energy and attention to really that whole system and how it works together. One last tool that I've been experimenting with, we have been doing culture surveys in Gore for quite some time, because how the culture is working is critically important. And it's been a team tool. And what I found is I needed a tool to really make sure how the leaders are behaving in this organization. So some of our leaders are scared about this tool. But if you really want to get down to the essence, ask yourself, do you create an environment of trust? Is there fear of retribution? Are the leaders approachable? Are they really valuing diverse perspectives? These are kind of the core, you think about behaviors that we're trying to drive. And so this is a recent tool that we're actually having our senior leaders be evaluated on by their peers, just to make sure that, again, leadership plays a critical role here, that we're really living up to what we say we do. And then lastly, I found it really critical to kind of connect the dots for the organization, so that the culture is only there to allow us to innovate, but that's what comes first. So if you create the right environment and you spend time on the values and the foundation, that's what allows you to attract the talent and the passion of our associates in the company. And it's that leads to the innovative products that create shareholder value for us. So we're very clear about that sequence. So a lot of companies ask about how do you innovate, what do you invest in R&D? They're not really the right questions to ask. We would flip that and talk more around how do we create the right environment where collaboration happens naturally, that people actually want to work together, that they actually like to be part of something greater than just the individual contribution. And if you get that part right, all the other pieces fall in place that allows us to create this great innovation cycle within Gore. So that's what I had to share with you. And we have a little bit of time to ask some questions since I took a very helicopter view here. Any thoughts, questions? Yes?
Can you talk about communication? I feel as if you mentioned a lot about the culture and everyone has to live it, and sometimes the herding of cats. How is all this communicated to everyone?
So again, we're a very communicative, intensive environment, and that's not just with leaders. You think about every day someone's out selling their idea. So there's a huge expectation of folks that are communicating at a team level, at a one-to-one level, and then obviously all kinds of different forums that we have in terms of broad-based communication, town hall, kinds of forums that I get involved in and other leaders get involved in. So we have multiple ways of communicating. Again, a lot of face-to-face. Our one thing we're obviously challenging in Gore is a lot of our trust-based organization needs a lot of face-to-face time, which means a lot of global teams coming together. And how do we do that but augment it with other tools, in terms of either web-based or video conferencing-based to try to help teams kind of come together, more virtually. So that's a newer dimension. But I'd say in Gore, it's just intensive communication. Internally, we probably haven't done a lot of external communication. We're kind of a very private company, both privately held, but also very much, they call us the best kept secret, which has some advantages unless you want to hire someone, they don't know about your company. So we're doing a little bit more to get the connection externally so folks know a little bit more about what we're all about. Yeah?
I'd just like to know if you've seen this model approach implemented. So I'll just repeat. I just was wondering if you could talk about whether this approach to leadership and to management has been implied in publicly traded companies, because it sounds like there are a lot of benefits to keeping it private. I wonder if those could scale in other environments.
So I am aware of a couple companies that are working, and obviously this is one way, and my attempt here is not that everyone should adopt the Gore model. So everyone has a different way of kind of how they try to empower their organization. I think Whole Foods is probably one that I know has really adopted this kind of approach. I do find it's probably easier for younger companies as they emerge, then they can shape it versus large companies having to almost undo some of the value. So I don't know if I can give any advice to some of the larger scale companies. I think it's very possible in a public setting. I do think it presents some other challenges in terms of time horizons and how much you have to communicate. This is a valuable part of what drives your business results. Delivering good results helps too, by the way. Yeah.
A little bit about the compensation scheme.
We could spend days on that one.
Because whoever determines your salary has some level of authority on you, right?
Yeah. So it's a very complex system. But if you can imagine a group of engineers that work together on a project, they all rank each other. And they have an exercise with no criteria of who is making the greatest impact to the success of the enterprise. Let's say there's a group of 20 engineers from 1 to 20. And only rank the folks that you truly can, that you've worked with, that you can comment on. There's a comp committee, which is a combination of leadership and other functions that looks at that as input, because obviously you're not going to get one universal view of the world. Ironically, the top contributors are typically very consistent, as well as the bottom contributors, and you spend more of your discussion kind of churning in the middle. But it's a really, I'd say, constructive conversation that happens where we end up with literally a list from 1 to 20. We then plot their salaries, and as we make projections, obviously we want to see a slope curve where you've got the highest contributor making more money than the lowest contributor. And what it does is a couple things. One is it puts a lot of that judgment in the hands of the peers, and again, with oversight, because you have to sometimes synthesize a lot of different views. The other thing I find that's very powerful, it doesn't reward folks that are just in leadership positions or kind of classically folks that have kind of taken a management vector. In innovative companies, you really need to also value roles like the specialists and like your deep scientists. And this is an opportunity for everyone to make a contribution, not based on seniority, not based on title, but truly by the impact that they're making. So it has a lot of other nuances that we think supports our values. So that's roughly how we do it. And then we have a process that kind of synthesizes across functions, because obviously you also need to make sure that you're paying an engineer versus a manufacturing associate versus a business leader. So each of our 4 divisions actually does what's called a top contributors list, where we're really looking at who's making the most contribution and impact from an enterprise perspective. So that's loosely how it works. Again, it's a lot of work. I know there's no perfect compensation system, but I will say it tends to drive more of the right values and input than if you had the single manager really deciding how folks are going to get paid. We have found it to be much more in line with certainly our values. I could give you a couple more days on that one, though.
Can you talk more about in terms of bringing in more senior people? I mean, if you want to bring in, say, COO of a Procter & Gamble, how would you bring that in if everyone's coming in as an associate?
Yeah. I suspect it would be more difficult the more senior in the organization, just because of the cultural nuances and trying to navigate through that. Typically, when we bring an outside experienced person in, we tend not to put them right into a leadership role. If you think about our philosophy, they may have the hard skills, but they actually don't know how to get things done within our environment. So it's a higher risk when we do that. And when we do that, we do a lot of preparation for the team, and the team has already come to the conclusion we really need a leader. So they are very much actively involved in the process. Our preferred route is to bring someone into like maybe a strategic marketing role or a technical role or a functional leadership role, where they can really display their technical skills, functional skills, and then they get the chance to really influence and develop that followership naturally, versus they've got a big L stamped on their forehead, which again is a risk for the individuals and is a risk for the organization. And you can imagine the more senior the person, they don't even realize how shaped they've been with other environments, of how they truly get the work done as a leader. I was talking to a group that we can take a high-performing leader and strip them down to their knees, because they don't realize if you take away the authority, the power, the title, and they have to do it all through influence, selling, it's really frustrating. So we're really cautious, I would say, about the number of hires we make that route versus bringing a whole. So we would tend, my role, for instance, or my path is very typical in Gore. So we have several thousand engineers in Gore that have come in doing projects and have kind of grown up in the organization. So it tends to be more of that kind of organic growth more than we've hired a whole slew externally, with some exceptions where we've had skill needs. Yeah.
So we're currently undergoing some rough economic times, and both are employers and students, I guess. And one question I had was, under such conditions, how do you upkeep a culture like war right now? Like, I mean, sometimes you may have to make some very tough decisions and cut some of your workforce. How does the culture sort of sustain itself and weather through those type of troubled times?
Yeah, I think the misnomer is that we haven't had trouble spots along our whole history. You think about the very humble beginnings. There was a lot of tough decisions the company had to make. Certainly in my stay at Gore, we've had our ups and downs where we had to let folks go, and it's kind of left an imprint on me of being as proactive as possible to anticipate and really make sure we are looking at some of the lead indicators so we don't overextend ourselves in terms of resourcing and the like. It becomes a very natural discussion in our culture, though, because we have this view that we need to make sure the enterprise is healthy. And so if the ship isn't healthy, so letting a business that really is floundering and not really driving value is actually hurting the entire performance of the enterprise. So, we do make some very tough decisions about what businesses we stay in, what projects we select in, but we do it in a way that says this is not the most important, impactful thing for us to be working on. So in today's economic environment, the good news is we're having a banner year. We're beating all records in terms of profit and revenue. And I was chuckling that one of my concerns is how do you create this sense of urgency around driving organizational improvement in Gore? Because certainly we have things that we need to do. This current economic environment has become a perfect venue to start talking about how do we better prepare Gore so that we're maximizing our resources, that we're really driving the effectiveness of the organization. So that's how it's playing out today, right now in Gore. And I do think we would tend to take things on a longer term. So this is back to the privately held. For sure, I think we're going to see some softening in some of our markets. You can imagine in the automotive area, in some of our industrial sectors, we clearly anticipate we're going to be influenced by what's happening with our downstream customers. So we're preparing for that in terms of future hires and how do we better organize how we're getting the work done. The good news, it's in our control. So again, the more you can kind of prepare and do it proactively versus being forced into a crisis, I think everyone would like to prevent that. At least that's one of my goals anyway. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. Given your strong belief in the individuals and in diverse perspectives, can you share with us how does your organization manage differences within the organization? I mean, how do you make decisions through those differences? I mean, who has the final say, or is it by certain criteria, or is it majority view? And especially if the differences are even on aspects as fundamental as your culture, because as your organization progress along the way, perhaps certain aspects of your culture may have to change along the way. And there'll be differences in views. How do you actually manage these differences?
It's every day a challenge. And so there's a ton of work we do to get teams to form and storm. And you can imagine anytime you bring a team together that's diverse, and you think about it on a global scale, they're not always going to share a common view. And so there's a process you have to follow. I think there's fundamental to our culture is belief in all of our associates. It wasn't like a select few we believe in. So we talk about diversity in the context of our culture, that we want to value all opinions and perspectives. It's got to be done on a foundation, though, of trust and respect. So again, it's not about you win, I lose. It's really getting the team to be debating the issues versus bringing down or not valuing the individual. And so we work a lot on making sure there's a really robust discussion around the opportunity in the project, but it's not personal. It's not about not valuing your view versus another. So if you go into a GORE meeting, you'll see, again, these great debates going on. And it kind of can scare you. But again, it's a natural part of that process to get the best ideas to bubble up. So that's kind of, in general sense, as we talk about diversity. For sure, if you go to different regions in GORE, so there's a GORE culture of those values, but I can assure you there's subcultures all throughout the GORE world because it takes on the identity of the leaders as well as that particular culture. So if you go to Germany, there's a German culture of GORE that seems to be much more deliberate in how they talk about things, and we will do this. It's not counterculture, but that's just the way they, and so it's really important for our associates as they work with teams that they understand those nuances and they understand what's driving kind of what's formed and shaped them. So as we go into Asia Pacific, obviously that's a real area we're putting a lot of energy in of how do we make sure that the culture is working as we look at our Korean population or our China population. So I think it's the practices have to evolve and adapt in some of how they get the work done. We'll have subtle differences as you go from different parts of the GORE world. What we try to do, though, is our fundamental beliefs are our fundamental beliefs. This is kind of, you came into this company, and this is kind of the rules of engagement. So we differentiate between really what's valued and what we're going to allow a lot of flexibility and creativity. So a great example is I talked about the lack of use of titles. I wasn't entirely true on that because if you go to a location like Korea, titles are critically important for how they present themselves to their family, to their customers. And so you have many associates in Korea that actually have a title that they've made up. Some of them are really great titles, by the way, the senior VP. And I'm laughing about it, but the difference is that's how they present themselves to the outside world. How they behave internally, though, isn't different. They don't have any assumed authority or control. They don't have anything embedded in the title. So that's how we would take a practice and adapt it to the environment, but stay true to how we expect leaders to behave. Does that make sense? And so the trick, as we get further developed into Asia Pacific is what are those practices that do need to change and evolve that will become a constraint if we don't do that to adapt and stay true to kind of our core beliefs, is the way we approach it. But there's a ton of investment in team building. I can't tell you, when I go on that plane, it used to be the plane from Philadelphia to Munich, Germany, it'd be like a GORE fiesta. There'd be like 20 associates on the plane going to meet and build connections. And I think other companies would think about it as this huge expense, but it really is that team forming and building so that they're much more effective to tackle some of these tough issues. So if you invest up front, the way communication flows, because it's all based on a foundation of trust, is really what you're trying to do, because then all the other things happen quite smoothly. Okay, up there.
How do you sense your culture might change were you a public company? Is that one of the reasons why you were still private?
I'm guessing it would change in terms of how I'd spend my time, how other leaders would spend their time, probably a lot more investment in how we communicate to the external world, probably pressure on some of our long-term time horizons. The main reason, that we're not going public is, one, most companies go public because they need the cash and they think it's going to expand, that they can, grow. We don't have that challenge. So we don't find enough upside of going public. And so all the advantages of being invested in the things that make sense for us. Our shareholders are all investors in the company, their associates and the family. And so we found more advantage of staying private with not really all the advantages or upside of why we would even contemplate. And I will tell you, many companies, every week we get another company that wants to buy parts all of the enterprise. I think it would come at a great cost in terms of to your point, how we view this philosophy of driving our success. Not sure, because we're not public. I think if you deliver good results, maybe there would be less tension too. So, okay, yeah.
Could you talk a little bit more about how the CEO gets elected? Is it election or what is it like?
So this is a good story to end with. So I've been 25 years with the company. I used to be very proud about that, and it just now shows you how old I am. But and I was running one of our main divisions of Gore, co-leading it with 2 other associates, the fabrics division, which was actually our largest division in Gore. And our CEO, who was the first non-family CEO, kind of surprised the whole organization because he had been in the role for 5 years, and I think we all felt he was going to stay in that role for probably a good couple more years, if not 5. And so the timing as well as the selection caught all of us off guard. And as Deborah described, there was a process that we were all inputting, not to replace the CEO, but just for planning, succession planning, so no one really associated with anything that was going to happen timely. So I don't know the exact process, but I know there was probably several hundred of us that were asked to input on who we would support as the next CEO for the company. And actually, there were some other candidates that were both older than I was, and I think they actually more aspired to be the CEO. So that caught me off guard. In fact, I went home and I said, did I actually have that conversation? And I remember I was not allowed to say anything to anyone except my immediate family for 6 months. And you could probably tell by now that I like to talk, so that was really tough. So I went home and I'm thinking, did this really happen? And I remember my, at the time, 15-year-old son, and you can imagine 15-year-old boys. I went home and I said, Brian, something happened at work today. And he looked at me and says, Mommy, did you get fired? I said, no, that's a lot of confidence in your mother. So anyway, so that's how it went. So it was, I think, very consistent with, again, our overall approach to leadership, which is to really make sure that there's followership along the way, which actually made my job a little easier because I knew I had some built-in support in taking on this role, from obviously who are my peers in the organization, which are some of the senior leaders in Gore. It's a very different approach, isn't it? So the ultimate decision was made by the board. I do want to say this, similar to the compensation committees that I mentioned that might happen with any team, the board of directors ultimately took all this input. So again, I'm sure there was all kinds of input. It wasn't like my name was plastered all over. I'm sure there was all kinds of input, and they had to kind of process that and come out with the final decision. Yeah. Right here.
Related to the previous question, but how do you maintain the current culture when the company pursue for the further growth? Because normally it becomes more and more difficult to maintain a less bureaucratic and more trust-based culture, which embraces employees to commitment and also driven culture. I've seen a lot of companies changing their they need to change their culture. Yep. They need to put some bureaucracies when they when they grow like 2 or 3 times.
Yeah, I
So-
can't go back to that slide, but I think the one slide that depicted our culture diagram probably describes the evolution best. And so if you go back in the early days of Gore, we never had a ring that we called key disciplines. And you know, for us, you know, again, discipline structure was always viewed as negative, you know, and then bureaucratic. And it was really coming to the understanding that there's things actually that we're quite disciplined and structured about that align with our culture, that we need to do a much better job communicating throughout the organization. And what you find is the organization actually tolerates that, they accept it, they actually are okay with it. You just need to be really mindful of where you put those disciplines in place to drive, you know, the output. And so if you just let it be a free-for-all, you will truly have chaos, and it really will become something that is not a healthy culture. And I think if there's one takeaway from this presentation, our culture of Gore has evolved over 50 years. There is not one culture. Those practices that you see have evolved. You know, so we talk about them with certainty today, but 10 years ago, some of them didn't exist. And even in the early days, some of them didn't exist at all. They were just concepts. So we've continued to perfect that so that our language and being clear about what's center and what really needs to adapt and change. And that's why, you know, again, you've got to invest time. That's why I spend an inordinate amount of time. That's why leaders need to spend a lot of time, because you're really making sure the whole system works collectively so that you're harnessing all of this energy to greater good. And so this idea that you just distribute the leadership and walk away from it would truly be just chaos and disastrous. And so you know, you have to have a stomach for really putting a lot of effort in and understand how all the systems work together. And so I'm actually very confident that one, because we have the strong foundation. You know, many companies are trying to find that core of values. We have that. It's now making the other pieces work on a global scale and continue to fine-tune it as we go into new regions. So that I think is the trick. But for sure, it takes as much investment as you're going to invest in your strategy and your portfolio management. And I give it equal time as some of those other elements that are probably well vetted in the business community. Because I find if you do that right, if you focus on the fundamentals, you focus on the values, you know, it's probably the biggest contribution you can make as leaders to truly get the full impact of the organization. Because I think this idea of channeling it all through these single leaders that have all the knowledge and power is quite honestly becomes a constraint. So, okay, one more burning question, way up in the back. Is it a good one?
Yeah, your second or third slide, you had your 4 principles, and one of them was water line.
Yeah, I thought someone would ask that.
Elaborate on that, and why is that a principle? And what
Yeah, so, and everyone has added or tried to add new principles, but Bill Gore was like, keep it simple. There's 4 principles, and one is, I'll go through them quickly. Freedom. It's a freedom to help and encourage each other to grow and develop. Fairness is we want to be fair to each other, our suppliers, our customers, and our, you know, all of our stakeholders. Commitment is an important one. When I make a commitment, it's a personal contract. So we don't have people filling out time cards and you know, it's really important when I say I will do this, that it's like your personal commitment to that individual. So that's an important one. The last one is called waterline because we have a lot of analogies with the Gore ship. We're a big ship, and the whole idea here is there's a waterline on a ship. And anything you are thinking or contemplating that could drill a hole below the waterline, that could put the company in harm's way, whether it be financially, reputation, we want you to consult with other knowledgeable associates before you drill a hole below the waterline. So it was the whole idea of consultation. And I think what folks confuse, they talk a lot about drilling the hole under the waterline. It was actually very empowering because once you know where your waterline is, you can drill a lot of holes up top and take a lot of risks. And so we talk about it on both sides of that waterline. So I'm glad you asked that. You picked that up. That's good. So those are the 4 principles that our associates, as they make decisions, are always navigating through how does it line up against those principles as we drive forward. And you'll hear, if you go into the halls of Gore, these words are used constantly. I mean, the whole idea of freedom, fairness, they just become a part of our language. And with that, I think we're done. Thank you, everyone. Yes, thank you. Oh, thank you. Good, thank you. Okay. All right, good. Good luck. Okay, good.